interesting topic. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Mr. Phillips.
Pass some of those out to everybody.
Yes, sir.
You must be hard up for speakers if you have me back 4 times.
We know a good thing when we see one.
4 times. I'm cheap.
4 times the charm, right?
I appreciate you all having me come back. And Bill Williams, one of our historians there, rode up with me. My wife has decided that I can't drive distances by myself anymore. And we're going to talk about a little interesting character in the Civil War history that a lot of people don't talk about. But sometimes one event in a person's life completely overshadows their entire career. They become known for that event, and the rest of their life seems to become irrelevant. Ted Kennedy, for example. Whether you like or dislike, he's known for Chappaquiddick. That's about all you think about. Orson Welles. You hear about him for War of the Worlds, but he has a rather noted career. Abraham Lincoln, to a certain degree, with him being the first president assassinated. John F. Kennedy, to a certain degree, because of his assassination. But the case in point of the Civil War is Confederate Major General Earl Van Dorn. Now, history has remembered him more for his manner of death and completely ignores his life and career. And this presentation will attempt to change that, but we will spend a few minutes on his tragic demise. Earl Van Dorn was born on September the 17th, 1820, near Port Gibson in Claiborne County, Mississippi, the son of Judge Peter Aaron Van Dorn and Sophia Donaldson Caffrey, a niece by marriage of President and General Andrew Jackson. Earl Van Dorn is one of 8 children. After preliminary education in Baltimore, Van Dorn secured an appointment to West Point from his great-uncle, President Andrew Jackson, in 1838. Van Dorn was well educated and well prepared for West Point, but he graduates 52nd out of 56 cadets in the class of 1842. His classmates included future generals William Rosecrans, John Pope, Abner Doubleday, and George Sykes, as well as future Confederate generals Gustavus Smith, Alexander P. Stewart, Daniel Harvey Hill, Richard Anderson, Lafayette McLaws, and James Longstreet. Now, upon graduation in 1842, Van Dorn becomes a 2nd lieutenant and is posted at Fort Pike in Louisiana, Fort Morgan and Mount Vernon Arsenal in Alabama, and Pensacola Harbor in Florida with the 7th United States Infantry Regiment. And it's during this time that he met Martha Caroline Carolee Godbold, whom he married in December of 1843. He was 23, she was 16. She was described as a girlish-looking little woman, modest and shy, slight and graceful. They would have one son, Earl Van Dorn Jr., and a daughter, Olivia. With tensions with Mexico increasing in the mid-1840s, Van Dorn of the 7th Infantry were stationed in Brownsville, Texas, Fort Texas, that is also known as Fort Brown. During the Mexican War, Van Dorn fought at the Battle of Monterrey in September of 1846, and during the Siege of Veracruz in March of 1847. He is then assigned to General Winfield Scott's staff and promoted to 1st Lieutenant. He fought at the Battle of Cerro Gordo, where he was brevetted a captain, then the battles of Contreras, Churubusco, and Belingate. During the fight for Mexico City, Van Dorn is wounded in the foot, and again wounded during the Battle of Belingate. Van Dorn had been brevetted a major by the end of the Mexican War. In the 1850s, Van Dorn was stationed in Louisiana, Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis, and saw action against the Seminoles in Florida. Other posts included in Louisiana and Texas. In 1855, he was named captain in the 2nd United States Cavalry and saw action against the Comanches and Seminoles. Now, during these Indian conflicts, Van Dorn was wounded a total of 5 times, including serious wounds against the Comanche where he was shot with 2 arrows, one in the left arm and wrist and one to the right side and rib cage, and was not expected to live. But after an extended convalescence, he returned to duty and fought Indians in Kansas and Texas. Van Dorn was on a leave of absence from the United States Army for much of 1860 and 1861. With the Civil War brewing, Van Dorn, like many other Army officers, had to choose whether to remain with the Union or cast their lot with the fledgling Confederacy. Van Dorn chose the latter and resigned his United States Army commission effective January 31st, 1861. According to a fellow officer, Van Dorn was an ardent advocate of the right of succession. Returning to his home state of Mississippi, Van Dorn is appointed Brigadier General in the Mississippi Militia and took command of that body when the previous commander, Jefferson Davis, becomes Confederate President later in the spring of 1861. He resigned from the militia in March of 1861 and was named Colonel of Infantry in the Confederate Army and is stationed in Texas. He was given command of the Confederate forces in Texas, and his command captured 3 Union ships, one of them being the Star of the West of Fort Sumter fame, in Galveston in April of 1861, and forces the Union surrender of their forces at Indianola. Van Dorn is summoned to the Confederate capital in Richmond and is named Colonel of the 1st Confederate Cavalry. He is quickly promoted to Brigadier General in June of 1861 and then a Major General by September. In early 1862, Van Dorn was transferred to the Trans-Mississippi District, mainly to control bitter rivals Sterling Price and Benjamin McCulloch, and to organize an effective fighting force. 2 other Confederate notables, Braxton Bragg and Henry Heath, had both turned down this position. Van Dorn takes command of the Trans-Mississippi in January of 1862, sets up his headquarters in Pocahontas, Arkansas. Now the Federals had forced nearly all of the Confederates out of Missouri by early 1862. Van Dorn had roughly 17,000 troops and 60 cannon in the newly organized Army of the West. He wanted to attack and destroy Union forces, move into the Show Me State, and capture St. Louis, thus adding Missouri to the Confederate cause. Now, hoping to cut off the Federal Army of the Southwest under Samuel Curtis, Van Dorn splits his army, and in order to move more quickly, leaves his supply trains behind. This move and other troop movement delays proved to be disastrous. In one of the few engagements in the war when the Confederates outnumber the Federals, Van Dorn engages the Federals at the Battle of Pea Ridge, otherwise known as Elkhorn Tavern in northwest Arkansas, on March 7th and 8th, 1862. Now, after some initial success on March the 7th, a Federal counterattack and the Confederates' lack of reinforcing supplies, Van Dorn's supply wagons were 15 miles away. The Army of the West was forced to retreat, leaving the Federals in command of the field. Although Van Dorn deserves much blame for the defeat, the loss of Generals Benjamin McCulloch and James McIntosh left a hole in Van Dorn's command structure, which could not be adequately filled. The Army of the West was ordered across the Mississippi to bolster the Confederate Army of Tennessee. Van Dorn said of his defeat at Pea Ridge, "I was not defeated, but only foiled in my intentions. I am yet sanguine of success and will not cease to repeat my blows wherever the opportunity is offered." Get a little idea of his personality. Now positioned near the vital railroad hub of Corinth, Mississippi, controlled by the Federals since right after the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862, Van Dorn commenced to retake Corinth and initiated the Second Battle of Corinth on October the 1st, 1862. This battle is not talked about a whole lot because it gets overshadowed by the Kentucky campaign, but this is an absolute and utter bloodbath down there. If you ever get a chance to go to Corinth, Mississippi, you need to learn about this battle. But again, after having initial success, Van Dorn's repeated attacks were repulsed over the next few days, and Van Dorn was again forced to retreat, leaving this important transportation hub in Federal control. Now, for his actions at Corinth, Van Dorn is sent before a court of inquiry. And although he is acquitted of all charges, he would never command an army again, and was relieved of command of the Trans-Mississippi. Union General William Sherman wrote during this time that he, meaning Sherman, heard of Van Dorn's lack of supplies and that Sherman dispatched cigars, liquor, boots, and gloves through the lines for Van Dorn's use. Sherman was 2 years ahead of Van Dorn at West Point. So. Now in command of Confederate cavalry, Van Dorn seeks to disrupt Union attempts to take Vicksburg. He gives Federal General U.S. Grant a good thrashing at the Battle of Holly Springs, Mississippi on December the 20th, 1862, capturing and destroying much of Grant's supplies, and effectively ends Grant's first attempt to take Vicksburg. This is about the only time Grant really loses during the war. Now, he loses other battles, but it's more of a redeployment than backing off. Van Dorn eats his lunch at Holly Springs. Van Dorn's, this cavalry ride, Van Dorn rode 500 miles in a little over a week, wreaking havoc in the Union rear. Now, in early 1863, Van Dorn is named commander of all Confederate cavalry in the District of Mississippi and Louisiana. He then joins the Army of Tennessee and sets up command at Spring Hill, Tennessee in late February, early March 1863. He throttles a Union force at the Battle of Thompson Station on March the 5th, 1863. And on March the 16th, 1863, he is given command of the Cavalry Corps of the Army of Tennessee. Van Dorn fights his last organized engagement at the First Battle of Franklin, Tennessee on April the 10th, 1863. Now, during this time, Van Dorn apparently has some type of run-in with fellow Confederate cavalryman Nathan Bedford Forrest, which nearly led to a duel. Forrest is said to have commented that he had enough Yankees to fight without fighting Van Dorn. Now, in May of 1863, you remember that Van Dorn has his headquarters at Spring Hill, Tennessee, namely at the Martin Cheers Mansion, the home of Dr. James Bodie Peters and his wife, Jessie McKissick Peters. The story has it that Van Dorn and Mrs. Peters had struck up a friendship, which some believe was more than just mutual admiration. On May the 7th, 1863, 155 years ago yesterday, Dr. Peters came to Van Dorn's office at or near the Martin Cheers Mansion to request a pass to travel through the Confederate lines. When Van Dorn turned to his desk to write the pass, Dr. Peters shot Van Dorn in the back of the head, killing him instantly. Van Dorn was 42 years old. Dr. Peters escaped to Mississippi, where he was then captured. Dr. Peters said that Van Dorn had violated the sanctity of his home, but was acquitted of all charges. Jessie McKissick Peters maintained for the rest of her life that there was no improper relationship. Others have maintained that Van Dorn was killed elsewhere and that his age brought him to the office, so Van Dorn's reputation would not be sullied. Van Dorn was initially buried in his wife's family plot in Mount Vernon, Alabama. An eyewitness to the initial burial said, "As we watched the immense procession of soldiers, the hearse drawn by 6 white horses, its gorgeous array of white and black plumes that bore the grand casket of which the dead hero lay, we thought with sorrow of the handsome face still in death, the heartbroken wife, thus being cruelly widowed. His little daughter was the chief sorrower visible at his bier, the wife being too prostrated with grief to leave her room." In 1899, one of Van Dorn's sisters, Emily Miller, had her brother's remains disinterred and brought home to Port Gibson, Mississippi, where he rests with the rest of his family in Wintergreen Cemetery near the family's home. At the reburial, Van Dorn's casket was opened, and his remains, after 30 years of interment, were in an excellent state of preservation, being said that the form was clad in a Confederate gray uniform of a major general, the belt, buckles, and epaulets being intact, and around his shoulders were golden, soft curls familiar to soldiers on 100 battlefields as the intrepid warrior rode at the front of his men and urged them into battle. That's rather romantic, isn't it? It's going to get worse. All right. Now let's finish up with Earl Van Dorn's physical description and personality. He is known to be physically short. In 1861, a correspondent described Van Dorn as, "The general is rather undersized, of a spare frame, erect and graceful in his movements, his mustache long and light, but otherwise he's closely shaven, which is cause of his youthful appearance. His uniform was a gray tunic with buff collar and cuffs, heavy gold braiding on the sleeves, 3 stars on each side of the collar, with one in the center being the largest. As he drew back his buck gauntlets, I caught sight of a cross, embroidered thereon in scarlet silk and an ancient symbol of rank." Another said that he used to ride a beautiful bay Andalusian horse, and as he came galloping along the lines, his yellow hair waving in the wind, and his bright face light with kindliness and courage, we all loved him. His figure was lithe and graceful. His stature did not exceed 5 feet 8 inches, but his clear blue eyes, his firm set mouth, his white strong teeth, as well as his cut nose with expanding nostrils, gave assurance to a man whom men could trust and follow. Van Dorn was known as an accomplished painter, and in a letter to his wife from 1856 he says, "I have a new set of paints given to me by Mrs. Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston, and my favorite pastime, painting, will fill up and consume some of these long hours of summer." He was also a prolific writer of poetry. But apparently Van Dorn also had an affection for the ladies. It is said to have had numerous affairs. One newspaper man said not too long before Van Dorn's death that he was the terror of ugly husbands. Van Dorn's wife, Carrie, died on January the 19th, 1876. His son, Earl Van Dorn Jr., was born on July 27th, 1854, and passed away on April the 3rd, 1884. His daughter, Olivia, was born on April the 1st, 1852, and married Frank Aubrey Lumsden on October the 8th, 1868. Olivia died in 1878. There is also strong evidence, very strong evidence, that he fathered children out of wedlock, especially while stationed in Texas pre-Civil War. Now, in closing, there is consensus that Earl Van Dorn was a soldier of outstanding bravery, but his esteem for glory and honor kept him from carrying out effective campaigns with large armies. He stacked straight up in front of a defensive enemy in the face of artillery and breastworks with little or no reconnaissance. But when placed in command of smaller, primarily cavalry units, Van Dorn excelled and should be considered one of the best cavalry commanders of the entire Civil War. There's been a lot of controversy in the past year, couple of years, over Confederate flags in public places. Van Dorn had his own flag, his Army of the West flag, and I would suggest to you, if you want to fly something in front of your house and no one knows what it is, try this one right here. This is the Army, the Van Dorn's Army of the West
Think it was
flag.
Arabic and go after you, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not an ISIS flag, but
Yeah.
It's
very
like
common
the-
in the West. Early
Kind
in
of
the
like
war.
the Claiborne flag, it's another one of those good flags.
Mhm. Do you have any questions for me, or? I don't know
Well,
a whole lot.
the point, if we're, I guess, a Civil War discussion group, and so if we do not talk about and, don't besmirch his private life, but only talk about his public career or whatever, sort of like, there's I guess, a point in management and leadership, and sort of do not be promoted beyond your level of competence. You're competent at a low level, and you rise to your level of incompetence. Well, apparently with the defeat at Pea Ridge, other places, well, too impetuous was not effective there. But then at Holly Springs, well, that was darn good. So his area of competence by performance tended to be the low-level cavalry raider. We might say he was as good as John Hunt Morgan, Nathan Bedford Forrest when it came to be a cavalry raider.
In my opinion, if Van Dorn isn't killed when he is, we may be talking about Earl Van Dorn much more than we talk about Nathan Bedford Forrest. Because Nathan Bedford, he really comes up after Van Dorn's death. Not saying he's not competent, I'm not saying anything like that. It's just that Van Dorn was kind of in his way. And Van Dorn is military where Nathan Bedford Forrest isn't.
Well, considering Forrest run in with Bragg, apparently
Forrest
had a
Forrest ran in
problem.
with anybody, with everybody, so. And,
Bragg wasn't too nice a guy either. He had a lot of problems.
Yeah, he's deserted shot,
Yeah, he
migraines and yelling all the time.
Well, I appreciate you having me come up, and hopefully you learned a little bit about a fella who they don't talk about a whole lot, gets overshadowed by one thing, and he deserves a whole lot more credit than what he
And
gets.
speaking of him being overshadowed by his death, would you use the same description for Bull Nelson? One of your Richmond guys?
The big question during the Kentucky campaign of 1862 is, what if Bull Nelson isn't killed and he's at Perryville instead of Gilbert? Well, number one, I don't know.
Yeah.
But number two, I also know that Bull Nelson followed orders. And he and Buell were buds. So he would do what he's told.
Why did he and Jefferson, well, it was one of the Jefferson Davises and one on the Union side, but was it Jefferson A or Jefferson C? I get this.
Jefferson C. Davis
Jefferson C.
is the one who kills Bull
What
Nelson.
did they get into it about that he?
Well, in my other talk that I do about the assassination of William Bull Nelson, it's over a matter of honor. There's a whole lot of stuff going on, and this isn't talked about in today's world very much, but you have Jefferson C. Davis, who is a regular Army guy. Bull Nelson is a major general of volunteers. And there was a respect problem going on. Nelson had made the comment that people from Indiana were just poor white trash from the hills of Kentucky, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Jefferson C. Davis is from Indiana. And so there's a lot of mouthing going on. They get into it about a week before the killing. And Nelson relieves him. And that just completely goes all over Jefferson C. Davis. And a person who witnesses the murder is a fellow named Oliver Morton, who is the governor of Indiana. Very, very powerful. If they had telephones at the time, if he called Washington, Lincoln would answer the phone. That's how powerful this guy was. Well, he's standing there watching this whole thing. Well, what's he doing in Louisville? So, it's a neat little story. Well, I'll let you all get on with your meeting.
But in another comparison between the two, I guess the Van Dorn's killer acquitted on all charges, and the killer of William Bull Nelson not prosecuted either. So apparently, other than what you did on the battlefield, you could get away with murder during the Civil War.
And some people did.
Yeah.
They still say it's who you know.
And Bull Nelson was so polarizing. He has three fellas that are really his supporters, and that something needs to be done, you can't have this. Well, they're all three killed at Perryville. Isn't that convenient? A week, 10 days after his death. So there's nobody to take up his cause on the Bull Nelson deal. And of course, Van Dorn, he's Earl Van Dorn. But you were talking about being promoted too high, similar to John Bell Hood. You leave him in a certain position, he's going to do excellent. You get him too high, he doesn't perform as well. So, thank you all. Yes, sir.
Excuse me, what's new at the Richmond Battlefield Museum?
What's new at the Richmond Battlefield Museum? I didn't bring it with me, but we got a artifact last year. Did I tell you all about this?
No.
Okay. in Christmas of 2016, we are not busy during the winter months. Okay, I'm just going to be honest with you. And if you have been to the Richmond battlefields, you know that we have brochures like crazy. And because most of the people at the Battle of Richmond do not have books written about them. Claiborne has a couple, or one on Earl, on Edmund Kirby Smith, there's one on Bull Nelson, but everybody else, I don't want to say they're nobodies, but they're third and fourth tier guys. So with the help of Bill, over the years, we have written these brochures to tell the story of these fellas that were very, very important. You just don't know about them. And also buildings, people who played a role at the Battle of Richmond that didn't have anything to do with it, that may not have been there, like Jefferson C. Davis. So I got on our handy-dandy computer, and I was trying to think, how can we make these brochures better than what they are? Well, what is one thing that is unique to each of us, but was also unique to Civil War soldiers? It's your signature. So I was thinking, if we can find the signatures of these guys, that makes them more relatable to people today. Makes sense? So I got on the handy-dandy computer, and I thought, we'll just start with Bull Nelson. Type it in. Bull Nelson's signature. And of course it does its voodoo that it does, and it pulls up several searches, but one of them is Lincoln's signature on Nelson's commission. What in the world is this? So of course I hit it, and it's an auction house in Burbank, California, that has Bull Nelson's commission as a major general signed by Abraham Lincoln and Edwin Stanton for sale. It was in an auction in early 2016. It did not meet reserve. It did not sell. It had no bids. So we called the auction company and said, is it still available? And of course, when you deal with auction companies, sometimes you might be a little, is this really legit or anything? Well, this auction company sold one of 5 known Galileo signatures for $4.5 million. These people know what they're doing. So they said, well, we don't know, but we'll contact the seller. So they contacted the seller, and the negotiation started. And of course, when you're doing negotiating on something like this, the price is going up. So we got up to a certain level, and we had a deal. And Bob Moody, who you talked about, paid for it. And then the Battlefield Association was going to raise the funds to purchase it from him. Because he fights as a major general in one battle, and it's Richmond, Kentucky. So we send the money out to California, and we wait, no commission, we wait, no commission. Well, then the phone rings, it's the auction house. The seller has pulled out. Said that it wasn't in very good condition, and we knew that. We knew it had a tear in it. We knew it had a little errant, not that big of a thing. So we thought we were done. It's nice, we know it's out there, but we're done. About a month after that, the auction house calls and says, are you still interested in the Nelson Commission? Oh yeah, oh yeah. Well, they were going to take the seller to court because they had a contract with him. The seller had done all this work and was getting, or the auction house was doing all this work and was getting nothing. And these people that's how they make their living. Well, more negotiation, the price goes up again. And a couple weeks after that, we get a package in the mail. We took it and had it framed. And we now have Bull Nelson's commission as a major general, signed by Abraham Lincoln and Edwin Stanton, and Lorenzo Thomas, who was the adjutant general at the time. And I don't know of another battlefield that has something like this. I'm not saying we're better than anybody else. I'm not saying that at all. But, how many places can say that they have? What would Gettysburg give for Robert E. Lee's commission?
It's in a better place. It's in a better place.
What, with us or?
With you, yeah.
There was other places he could go. I mean, he's from Maysville or Mason County. He could go there. Could go to Louisville and all that. But we think the most appropriate place is with us.
So when does your museum open, or is it open all week, or?
We're open all week, weekends, and hopefully, we'll try to stay open.
Yeah.
Reenactments at the end of August each year, the last weekend. We're known as the hottest event in the state of Kentucky, ... literally. But as I'm trying to tell, Bill's heard me say this, I'm blue in the face. We as Civil War people have to think 365. We can't think just 3 days a year. We have to think all the time. Ramage has to do that. You know, how can we get people here all the time and not just during a special event? And we're working on it.
Significant thing about Bull Nelson, even if he was not victorious at Richmond, he showed courage on the battlefield. And I'd say a person who showed as much courage and spirit as he did on the battlefield deserves the recognition, even if he was not the victor there. A magnificent personality
Well,
who deserves to be remembered.
At Richmond, all the stars lined up for the Confederates. Everything went right, except for one thing. One artillery battery got too far forward. Other than that, everything was perfect. I mean, it's a very basic battle if you do anything. They're just trying to get on the flanks all the time. And that's what they did. Just very simple.
Is it pretty much the biggest Confederate rout of the war, or one of them?
It's classified as one of, if not the biggest Confederate victory. Union losses are at 85 to 87% of men, material, horses, everything. It's the only time that a Union army ceases to exist, when the battle's over. And, then you start the what-if game. You know, Bragg could have gotten up here quicker than when he did. He's still around Chattanooga when the Battle of Richmond's fought. Edmund Kirby Smith takes off on him.
Well, the biggest what if, suppose Bragg had attacked at Munfordville when he had such an advantage. Eddie won a complete victory there. He could have taken Louisville and then threatened Indiana and the whole Midwest.
Buell outpaces him and gets up there, and Buell, in my opinion, he comes out of Louisville in 3 columns, and he's kind of like a basketball player. Come down the court, he kind of fakes Bragg out a little bit, and they get mired at Perryville. And very little of Kirby Smith's fellows are there. It's termed, by the end of the Kentucky campaign, Bragg and Kirby Smith's relationship is termed as icy.
Heth, who came up the Lexington Turnpike towards northern Kentucky, did he make it to Perryville?
Who's this?
H-E-T-H, Heth.
Heath.
Heath, sorry.
Well, it's Heth, but everybody calls him Heath.
Heath, sorry.
He's not a Perryville. And there's another person who's not at Richmond, but he's part of Edmund Kirby Smith's army, and has a lot to do with your shirt, is Colonel Littlepage Stevenson. He's part of the movement coming up, but he's sent over to Cumberland Gap to hold those Union soldiers. Jack Kirby Smith's worried about getting cut off from home, but they don't know that Union soldiers coming to Gap are starving. So, all right.
We got something for you.
Okay.